I'm Bud Polasky, and I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska on June 11th, 1926. My father was born in Lithuania, and he came to this country when he was a year and a half old, in I think 1890, and they came directly to Lincoln. My mother was born in Schuyler, Nebraska, and her family moved to Omaha, where there's a lot larger Jewish community, and she moved there at a very young age, and she went all through the Omaha school system and graduated from Lincoln High, or from Central High. My parents were married in 1919 and built a house in Lincoln where they lived until my father died in 1966. And my mother lived in Lincoln in an apartment until she died in 1973. My grandfather, on my father's side, died in 1913, so I never knew him. But he and my good friend Sanford Finkelstein's grandfather were very good friends, and they helped found the synagogue in Lincoln. Growing up, my parents were very active. My father was very active at the synagogue, and my mother was very active in Hadassah and the sisterhood. She actually won a Woman of Valor Award from the sisterhood and a merit award from Hadassah. And they always were very active in the community. Before the war, say in 1939 or 1940, they always had refugees that had come to this country from Europe over for dinner constantly. And during the war, there was a Lincoln Army Air Base, and I think every Sunday there were soldiers at our house for dinner. Growing up, we lived very close to my grandmother, lived maybe 6 blocks away, and my grandmother was a very matriarchal person, and the whole family spent a lot of time there. And my father had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and a very tight-knit family. We were always there for holidays and, during any type of family occasion. We were usually at my grandmother's house. As I said before, my grandfather died in 1913, my grandmother died in 1951. So I spent a lot of time with her, and she used to take care of me when my parents would go away. So I was very close to her. Growing up in Lincoln, my 2 best friends were Everett Evnan and Sanford Finkelstein. I probably knew them since I was 11 years old, and still keep in contact. Maybe talk to them once every 4 or 5 weeks and see them as often as possible. And as I said before, I think that Sanford's grandfather and my grandfather also were very good friends. Growing up in Lincoln, especially where I lived, there was practically I didn't experience any anti-Semitism growing up until I was in the Army. And I think in our neighborhood, which was a neighborhood of mostly professors from university, could be one reason for that. Very liberal, but all through grade school, junior high, and high school, I never had any problem. Of course, there was a fairly small Jewish community in Lincoln, and growing up, I was active, I think, in Young Judea, and I spent my mother's sister moved to California in 1930. My mother and her sister were very close. And in 1930, my mother went to California with my sister and I and rented an apartment for the winter. And it was right next to a grade school, so she put me into kindergarten. And when I got back to Lincoln, since I was already in kindergarten, they put me in first grade. So all through my school years, I was always much younger than everyone else. And actually, I graduated in 1943 and had 1 year and 5 weeks of university before I was drafted in the service. When I was 17, Mal Sherman and I went to Omaha to enlist in the Naval Air Corps. And we went through all the tests and the physical and oral test and the exams and passed everything. The last thing they looked at for me was dental, and they said I had an overbite and couldn't wear an oxygen mask, and they wouldn't accept me in the Naval Air Corps. Mel went in and 11 months was school, and 11 months later was discharged. I waited till I was drafted and was in the Army for a little over 2 years. 18 months or 19 months of that was spent in Italy. When I got back from the service, I found a shoebox of letters that my father had written to several senators, and I don't remember who else, but at that time there was a law that you could not be sent overseas unless you had 6 months training or were 19 years old. And he wrote all these people saying that I only had 4 months training and I was 18 years old, and they all wrote back saying that there was nothing they could do at that point. And I was in the service, and I went to Italy and was volunteered to train for the 10th Mountain Division. I took that training, which was very scary and not thrilled about it. And the day the training ended and I was to report to the division in Bologna, Italy, the war ended. And after the war ended, I ended up in special service and ended up running tours of Italy and ultimately tours of Switzerland. And that was sort of my Army experience. And I came back and out of the service, and my father had me registered to enter the university. And when I got back, I had hepatitis and had to go to the hospital for 1 month, and so I couldn't start school till January instead of September. I went to the university, graduated from university in 1950, and went to work for the H.A. Wolf Company, which had an office in Lincoln. And in 1952, I met my wife, Maxine. And we were married and lived in Lincoln for about 7 months, and then moved to Washington. And we raised our family and still live.
Bud, let's go back and talk about your parents. What brought the Polskys to Lincoln?
Well, my grandfather's, when he left Lithuania, went to Akron, Ohio. He had a brother there, and I guess they got in an argument, and he decided he didn't want to stay in Akron. And he had cousins in Lincoln, so he moved to Lincoln, and that's where he stayed. He had like a general store in Lincoln on 9th Street, and which he ran, I think, probably until he died, and I think after he died, my father and his brothers, I think, ran it for a few years. My father was too old to go into the service during World War I, but two of his brothers, Maurice and Lou, both were in the service. Maurice was a very good baseball player. In fact, at one time, they were talking about he might end up in the in the major leagues, but he was injured during World War I, and that sort of ended his baseball career. And I think Sam, his other brother Sam, was probably too young to go in the service. They said my father was too old, and my father had a jewelry store near the railroad station in Lincoln, which I think was very successful. And about 1929, I think things got bad and more people were driving cars and riding trains, and he closed the store and went to work for my uncle, who had a Oldsmobile agency, and he stayed there until I think it was 1941, and then he bought a liquor store, which he owned and ran until till maybe the early 60s, and then sold it. And I remember just to keep busy, I think he spent most of his time at the synagogue, helping out. And he did part-time work at a drugstore in their neighborhood. My mother never worked, but was very active in all these different organizations most of their married life.
Bud, how about siblings?
I have one sister, Shirley, who is 5 years older than I am, and she went all through school in Lincoln and graduated from University of Nebraska, and married a doctor, pediatrician, Bob Grant, and they lived in Lincoln and raised 3 kids until Bob died. And she lived in Lincoln until about 2 years ago, and then moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, where she lives now. And I just had the one sister, and in my father's side of the family, there were 7 brothers and sisters, but only 6 first cousins. And one of them, Pep Sinton, died about 10 years ago, and there's still 5 of us left. One, Don Polasky, lives in Omaha. Ellen Monto lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Barry Polasky lives in Washington, and my sister lives in Scottsdale.
What was a holiday like in the Polasky home?
The holidays were always sort of a big deal. You know, my mother always had company. They say usually sort of the same friends, I think, year in and year out. And for the holidays, and also like Sunday dinner, there were always people there. It was always crowded. And I think that we always, when we went to synagogue, and after synagogue, we always went to my grandmother's house, I remember. And the other thing about the synagogue that I remember is when I was younger and going to Hebrew school, or if I went to service on Saturday, Sanford Finkelstein's grandfather always was the person at the bema that called up the people for aliyahs. And he would, if he saw me in the synagogue, he would talk for about 10 minutes about my grandfather, all in Yiddish, so I never knew what he was saying. But I was told, you know, he was always talking about his friendship. I wanted to mention something about my mother. They say she went all through school in Omaha, and her parents died much younger than probably before I was born. Has one sister who died in 1956 actually, and one brother. The sister lived in Los Angeles, and the brother lived in Creston, Iowa. The brother was in the scrap metal business. Her sister husband was related to the Boasbergs in Omaha and started out in the cleaning business in Omaha, and then when he moved to California in 1930, opened a cleaning store in Los Angeles. The cleaning store, which he opened in 1930, was still there when I went back by there about 2 years ago, which sort of shocked me. And as I said, my mother and her sister were extremely close. And when I was younger, we spent not a lot, but several summers we would go to California for the summer. And a lot of fond memories I have, and a lot of friends I had very young in California. In fact, I had several of my birthday parties in California at my aunt's house. My aunt was wonderful to me, and I really was very fond of her. she has two daughters. Her younger daughter lives in Highland Park, Illinois, and her older daughter died. Her brother had one child who lives in Florida, and her brother died, I don't know, probably in the 70s sometime, I don't remember when. And we would see my mother's brother in Crescent, Iowa fairly frequently, and we always enjoyed going there, enjoyed having him when he come to visit us. When I went to grade school in Lincoln. Well, I went to grade school, I think it was Prescott Grade School, and Irving Junior High, and Lincoln High School. When I was growing up, I didn't really grow till I was like about 16. I think I grew about 10 inches that year, and I always thought I liked to play football, but I was never big enough. But I did want to go out, and I had talked to the coach about becoming a manager, and it was in the following year. I was sort of arranged if I went to see him, he could work out something where I'd be a football manager. But in the meantime, friends of my parents had a magazine distributing business, and they lost a lot of their employees. They were desperate for help. So when I was 14 years old, I went to work at Lincoln News, and I worked there about 3 years, and when I was 16, I started driving a truck for Lincoln News Agency, and probably worked there till I was 17. I was 16 and a half, I think, when I started. I was 17 when I started college. I didn't work there when I was in college, but I worked there probably till I was 17. And
Who was that family?
That owned it was the Pokers family, Oliver Pokers, and his wife worked in the business, and then ultimately I think his sons took it over. We were in Lincoln 2 days ago, and that whole block is gone where it used to be, and the block in the spot where my uncle's Oldenburg agency also is not there anymore, and it was sort of nostalgic driving around Lincoln, seeing things. My friend Sanford's father had an auto parts business in Lincoln, and it still has the name of his owner, Ben's New Way, painted on the building. So that was interesting to see.
Bud, what was your mother's maiden name?
Bessel. My mother's maiden name was Bessel, and her father was Louis Bessel, and her mother, I think, was Rose. I'm not certain if I remember that correctly or not. And her brother was Abe Bessel, of course. And she had a lot of family in Omaha. She was related to the Siegels, Tybee Siegel and Earl Siegel were first cousins, and Minnie Frum was a first cousin, and Milton Frum family. And when I was younger, we did spend a lot of time in Omaha visiting family, and that was always good. I particularly enjoyed it because one of the Siegel, I think Buster Siegel, was a great baseball player, and he used to, whenever I'd come visiting, I know he would throw the baseball around, which actually my father also was a baseball player, and growing up in Lincoln, he played with it was a local team, I forget what they call it, but people would tell me how he one time pitched a no-hit game, and I heard that I don't know how many times growing up. And he was a big sports fan, which the whole family was. In fact, one time we took a trip, my father and I, and he just wanted to see the stadiums like Michigan and Michigan State, and we went to Notre Dame, and we went to several places. He wanted to just see the stadiums where he used to watch football. And his sisters and brothers were also big fans. In fact, they had tickets that passed down through our family until the time they forgot to renew them. for many years for the Nebraska football team. When my two aunts and two uncles were visiting our house in Washington, they were there over New Year's, and they started watching football around 11 in the morning till midnight. And my wife was really shocked. She'd never seen anyone that had that kind of interest in football, but they were really fanatic football fans. And growing up, that's sort of what I remember a lot about.
Bud, tell me a little bit about your days at the University of Nebraska.
Well, I started school, and I was very friendly with Mike Milder and Fred Teller because they were in classes, and they started talking me into joining the fraternity, which I did. I joined ZBT, and Mike Milder was my only pledge brother, and we went through all the pledge stuff together, and we're still good friends. I tried to see him, whenever we come to Omaha. And the schooling, I started out in engineering school, and that's what I studied for the year before I went into service. And when I came back for about 2 years, and I think I got sort of tired of I was in class like from 9 in the morning to 5 at night, and everyone else in fraternity, like they have 2 or 3 hours of class. So I switched from engineering to business administration, and I would have my graduating class was 1947, but because I was in the service, I graduated in 1950 with a business degree. And after I graduated is when I went to work for H.A. Wolf Company in Lincoln.
My name is Maxine Polasky. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska on September 29th, 1931. My father was born in what is now called the Ukraine, in a little village called a typical fiddler on the roof village called Shumsk. He was the youngest of 10 children, and by the late, I would say almost by 1900, 4 of the 10 siblings were in Omaha. And shortly after that, in about 1906 or 1907, my father came to Omaha. So of the 10 children of his mother and father, 5 lived in Omaha and 5 remained in the village in Shumsk. His father died of some kind of plague or typhoid fever, something that was going around. But his mother did not. So he came in about 1906. In the 1937, his mother, who at the time was 87 years old, hadn't seen 5 of her children, some of them now for over 30 years. So she made the trip from Shumsk all the way to Omaha. She was 87 years old. She came all by herself. She didn't speak a word of English, and I'm sure she didn't have a lot of money, although by then I think the children that were here were helping to support her. And my brother Bernie, who died about 4 years ago, told me, he was very young at the time, that the trains that she was in somehow or other didn't come to Omaha, so they went to Council Bluffs to meet her. And he said when they met her, it's like they hardly recognized each other. I mean, she knew my father as a young boy of about 18 or 19, and here he was like, probably 45 years old. But she came and she lived in Omaha until she died. My father told me that he was in the service. My father had sort of an interesting background because since he was the youngest, one of the older sisters demanded that he be sent to a Russian school. At that time, most of the Jewish people did not learn Russian. They didn't go to Russian schools. They went to cheters and everything right in the village. But my father was very, very bright. The others may have been too, but he went to a Russian public school. He was fluent in Russian, and he knew several other languages. And when he was about 17 or 18, he actually went beyond the equivalent of Russian high school to pharmacy school. He had about a year of pharmacy school, then he was drafted into the Russian army. My father was fastidious. He said he just couldn't stand it. He said they used to eat with their hands. They just ladled out the food in these dirty bowls, and he just couldn't take it. He said it was just everything was with their hands, no utensils. At any rate, so he deserted, and he left within a day or two. He went home, said goodbye to his mother. Since he had deserted, he had to leave immediately. So that was my father's coming to Omaha. He came to Omaha. He told me that even in Shumsk as a child, by then when he came in, say, 1907, he had had 4 siblings here. He told me that even in Shumsk, that Omaha had a good reputation, that you might have to work like a dog, you might have to work all day long, but you could always make a living in Omaha. That was Omaha's reputation in Shumsk. And I think part of it was because of the stockyards, definitely because of the railroad. I'm not sure about the stockyards, but definitely because Union Pacific was headquartered here. So my father came to Omaha. He worked for his older brother. He had White's Market. It was a little grocery store. And, excuse me, I take that back. At first, my uncle had a pawn shop. He later had a grocery store. And so my father learned the pawn business. And then he saved money. He had terrible, terrible jobs. I mean, shoveling manure, really bad jobs. But he was very thrifty, and he saved money, and then he was able to open his own pawn shop. My mother, as it turned out, they met in Omaha, but my mother grew up in Kremnitz, which was a larger little town. But it turned out to be only 13 kilometers from Shumsk, which was kind of an amazing coincidence because they met in Omaha. She was, I understand, absolutely gorgeous. I mean, people used to tell me I was pretty, I had nice skin, I was this, I was that, and they'd say, but oh, your mother. Unfortunately, she died when I was 3, so I don't have a good recollection of what she looked like. But apparently she was very beautiful, and in Russia the Cossacks and the soldiers were making passes at her, and they wanted to come, and her mother was frightened, so she sent her to Chicago to live with an older sister. So of 7 in her family, she had a mother and father, 1 sister in Chicago, and 5 siblings in Russia. She lived in Chicago. Her sister's husband, whose name was Montel Rosen, had relatives in Omaha, and they came to visit. And when she came with her aunt and uncle to visit Chicago, she was probably 19. My dad was about 26. They met at someone's house for dinner, and my father, who's the most conservative man I've ever met in my life, he couldn't make a decision for anything. They were married like 5 weeks later. And they were married. They had 4 children. I was the youngest. And my brother, Bernie, was the oldest. He was 13 years older than I. My sister Sylvia was 10 years older than I. Then I had a brother, Irving Albert White, who was 10 years older than I. Apparently they had a pretty happy family life, but unfortunately my mother had surgery, relatively minor surgery. She was fine. She was recovering. It was the 10th day of recovery. But in those days after surgery, they didn't walk you around. She had an embolism and she died. So I was 3. My siblings were like 3, 10, 13, and 17. And I think everything sort of fell apart after that because she really helped a lot, with the family. My father had the pawn shop. They were married. They lived with these 4 children. We lived behind the store, behind the pawn shop. The pawn shop was at 1313 Douglas Street. It was a street of all pawn shops. On one side was Ben Morris. On the other side was the Blunken family had a pawn shop on that street. The Dolgoff family, the Friedman family, that's Louis Friedman, who later owned Borsheim's, Mrs. B from Nebraska Furniture Mart, the Dolgoff family, and a family by the name of Chait all had pawn shops. Across the street there were 11 bars, and I read one time that it was the biggest capacity per capita of bars in any one location in the country. And my uncle Gershon owned Palace Billiards. It was the biggest one. My father would, there was one tailor shop, the Zolotushin tailor shop, and the rest were all bars. And my father, I used to go to the tailor shop a lot, but he would rarely let me go into the bar. But I used to like to go because my uncle would always give me like a free something free to drink, something sweet. We lived behind the store till I was about 7, and in retrospect, it was kind of interesting. I mean, people would say, you've got this beautiful little girl, and, how can you bring her up like this? It's not wise. There are all these bars, there are all these drunks, they had these flea bag houses, excuse me, within a block or two away. I remember it was like 10 cents a night for a room, sometimes a nickel, and it was pretty seedy. But I remember he said the fire department's 2 blocks away, the police department's a block away, which they all were. And I became very close with the Blumkin, Dolgoff, and Friedman families, who were all very, very good to me. But it was kind of hard because my mother wasn't there, and then my father got me working really young. I remember when I was 7, I was making out police reports, and you didn't have to have any brains. All you had to do, when he took something in pawn, he had this book, and all I had to do was just copy what was in the book. But I was pretty intelligent, and I could write. It was really just a question of what was just copying the sentence and the figures and the date. But I did do I worked in the store all the time until I graduated high school. And I remember my senior year at high school, I was very friendly with Esther Zerinsky, whose father had that tobacco company about a block away. And my senior year in high school, we just worked half a day and both went down to 13th and 12th and Douglas and worked in our father's businesses. But when I was 7, we moved to 35th Street. I then went to Yates grade school, and we moved around quite a bit. We never owned a house. Somehow or other, I had one cousin, Fred White, who was like the brains sort of the family. He was he was a lawyer, the only one at that time who had been to college and very successful, and he didn't believe in owning property. So we kind of moved around from house to house because either it was for sale or the rent was too much or whatever it was. But that was that. The year that I was about 8.5 or 9, my 3 siblings all left. My one brother went away to the university. My sister got in Nebraska. My sister got married and moved to Denver, and my brother Bernie by then had graduated law school and had moved to Washington, D.C. to take a job working as a civilian for the Navy. That was in 1940, so I guess I must have been 9 years old. So from that time, I was just kind of on my own. There was just my dad and me from the time I was 9 years old. When I was about 11 or 12, in 1942, my sister, who had been married and living in Denver, it was during the war, her husband was sent to the Philippines. So at that time she had a young child, just a few months old. So she came back to Omaha and she lived with us. And it was hard. I mean, I'm still very close with my nephew and with my sister, but I was a teenager and here was this kid and there was like diapers in the house and running around. And I remember when I started dating in high school, anyway, Michael, he was just darling and sweet, but it was hard, like having a little baby in the house. And I don't know, things always seemed kind of hectic and kind of crowded. And then her husband came back, and then he lived with us, and he didn't like Omaha. And it was sort of hectic, but somehow I muddled through. And then in high school, I began to have a lot of friends. I began to develop a lot of really lifelong friendships. The one thing I forgot to mention is from the time I was 6 until I was 12, I went to Hebrew school at the JCC, and that was kind of hard too because my father never learned how to drive. He was just always afraid of traffic. So I had to bus it everywhere. And of course, in those days it was pretty safe, but it was cold in the winter, and going from school, walking to the bus, taking the bus, going to Hebrew school, and some of the classes didn't get through till 6:15 or 7. I'd come home, there wasn't anyone home. It was kind of, I don't know. I mean, everyone says I remember everyone because all my friends were important to me because I didn't really have much else. My siblings were all gone by then. And, but then in high school, when I was about 11 or 12, I joined the Bethel. I went to Hebrew school there. that was it. I went to a bat mitzvah class, and that's where I met a lot of people who are still my very best friends today, girlfriends. And then I went to high school, and then I had a lot of good friends there, and it was still kind of bleak. My senior year was a happy one. To be honest, I had a nice boyfriend, and life was really nice.
Let's go back and talk about your mother,
God, I think I've talked so much. Okay.
about her maiden name.
Oh, okay.
And did anyone else in the family come over
Yes,
on her
yes,
mother's
yes.
side?
Okay. Oh, I also wanted to mention about my mother. I guess I don't know as much about her family because she died so young. The older sister died in the 40s. She had one sister who came to this country right before the Holocaust. She came with her 3 children in about I think they just made it out. It must have been 1939 or 1940. They came and they settled in New Orleans. They were there for a while. Some job possibilities didn't work out. And so they moved to Los Angeles, where they remained. She actually died. She was over 100. She just died about 3 or 4 years ago. And 2 of her 3 daughters died within 3 years after that. Neither one of them that old, like, 70 and 73, but one had cancer, one had a heart ailment. And she has 1 son, and he's still living. There were very few cousins. Most of them were killed in the Holocaust. I do know that my grandmother, I don't know how they found it out, but it was pretty much confirmed. My brother checked it out very carefully. She was shot to death by a Polish neighbor when she was 96 years old, the day before the war ended. But she was 96. That was on my mother's side. She didn't have a lot of relatives that came, and as I said, most of them were lost to the Holocaust, so I don't have much family history on that. Her sister told me that that her husband worked for a very, very wealthy landowner in Russia, in this Kremnitz, where they were from, and that they didn't have children. He and his wife couldn't and didn't have children. And when she was pregnant, he told her husband that he would like to have the baby named after him, which is kind of unusual because Jews usually don't name after living people. But he said he would. And so when he went home and he told his wife that he had made this promise, she said, she was a very, very religious woman. She said, how can you? How could you? She said, your father just died a year ago. She said, whatever, we have to name the baby after your father. He said, but I've told the boss. Anyway, it turns out that she prevailed. They named the baby after his father, and the landowner was livid, and he lost his job. They fell on very, very hard times. And she said it was one of the worst times in her life, but it saved their lives because things were so bad that they then contacted relatives in America and made arrangements to come to America. I mean, this was before the war happened. They didn't come because of the war. They came because things were so tough for them in Russia. And he had some well-to-do relatives in New Orleans. It didn't work out, but that's something. After I graduated high school, I went to Indiana University for 2 years. I then transferred to the University of Nebraska, and I graduated there in 1953. However, in 1952, I married Bud Polasky, who was from Lincoln, Nebraska. We met at a wedding. It was December 12th, the night of a huge blizzard in at least the Omaha-Lincoln part of Nebraska. It was given, Doris Schimmel married Irv Chesson. The Schimmels owned a big hotel. They knew a lot of people. 3,000 people were invited, not to the wedding, but to the reception. It was a small wedding with a huge reception. Such a bad blizzard, such a bad night, only 2,000 people showed up, but I was one of the 2,000. Had a date with Dave Rice that night. And Bud Polasky was one of the 2,000, and I was with Dave, and I remember meeting Bud on a stairwell. I was walking up with Dave, Bud was walking down. He was a groomsman at the wedding, and the groomsman, it was kind of a fancy wedding, wore white gloves. I still remember him with his hands in the white gloves. It reminded me of Hal Jolson in, I don't know, one of his movies or something, doing Mammy with the white gloves. But they were fraternity brothers. They were both CBTs at the University of Nebraska, so they chatted for a minute, and I just stood there. I mean, they didn't say it, they were just talking, and then I remember as as Dave said goodbye to Bud, Bud said, "Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" And so I said, "Yes, this is Maxine White." I think he actually asked me to dance, but that was the end of that. Nothing happened. That was December 12th. January 13th, I was dating Dave Rice at the time. January 13th was Orville Milder and Adrian Rice's wedding. And since Dave, and I was invited to the wedding, and Bud was invited to the wedding. And normally I would have sat with Dave, but he was an usher, and he sat with the bridal party. So I sat next to Bud. He's heard this a million times. I thought it was kind of boring at the time. And I remember he had to be back in Lincoln at a certain time, and I was so bored sitting there. I was waiting for Dave to finish whatever he was doing. And I remember when he asked me what time it was, I set my clock ahead 15 minutes. I remember I said, like, it was 2:45, he had to leave at 3, and I said, it's 3 o'clock. He said, oh, I have to go because I think he had a date or something in Lincoln. So that was that, but Doris Schimmel kept pushing him to call me and pushing him to call me, and so he called me. That was that.
Tell me about your wedding.
Oh, the
Date,
wedding.
date.
The wedding was August 24th, 1952. I mean, this summer of 2005 is hot. That summer was brutal. And I remember we had invited, the usuals, plus parents of our friends. I mean, people, that we had known so well, like Bud had the Evnans, the Finkelsteins, I mean, people he'd known all of his life, and some close friends, and I had invited the parents of my friends, or that was the plan. So hot, we were getting married at the Blackstone Hotel, and in the main ballroom there was no air conditioning. And I had an aunt or some relative who was working with the wedding, and she said, you cannot get married in that room. I mean, I remember the days were like 107 and no air conditioning. The only room in that hotel that was air conditioned was the house and garden room, and that held 98 people. They thought they could maybe squeeze 100 people in. So we had to cut all those people out, and I really, to this day, I think we both just felt terrible that we couldn't have these people that, we had known as children to our wedding, but it was just a very limited wedding, but it was beautiful, it was pretty, it was nice.
I want to hear about your children now.
So, we got married. We lived in Lincoln. Bud worked for the H.A. Wolf Company. I was finishing up. I had 1 year left to finish. I was completing my senior year of college when Bud had a chance to go into business in Washington, D.C., which we both were anxious to do. So he left about 2 months before I graduated. I lived with his parents for those 2 months. We had a little house before that. I lived with his parents. He came back. We packed up and we left and moved to Washington. I was pregnant, and we had the first of our 3 children. We had a daughter, Ellen, who was born November 10th, 1953, and then we had 2 boys after that, Jimmy Polasky and Bobby Polasky. I gave the 2 boys, Ellen I named after my mother. I gave the 2 boys very common names because I really wasn't that good a student. I was smart, but I never paid much attention to schoolwork. And when the teacher called Maxine, it was me. It was always me. And when she would call like Bobby or Tommy or Jimmy, 6 hands would raise because they never knew who it was going to be. I figured if they weren't good students, at least there'd be other Jimmys or Bobbies in the class. So Bud, go ahead and talk now.
Jimmy was born in November 27th, 1956.
No, May 27th.
May 27th, 1956. And Bobby was born on July 3rd, 1959. Jimmy was married in 1982. He lives in Washington. He has 2 children, a daughter 18, who just started the University of Wisconsin, I think as we speak, and a daughter, Jacqueline, who is 11, who almost will be 12 this month, and I think is in grade school. And My younger son, Bobby, has one son, Ryan, who is 9 years old, and he's in the 4th grade. And Jimmy and Bobby live fairly close to one another, and Ellen lives near downtown Washington. But our 3 children and our 3 grandchildren are probably all within 10 minutes of our house, so we do see them a lot. Jimmy's in the food business. He has a catering business, caters like to law firms, and if there's he doesn't do like bar mitzvahs or weddings, but he's mostly business type of catering. And he's got very busy lately, and he does the business, but a lot of law firms are very slow in paying, and I spend several days of the week doing his invoices and trying to collect money for him. My younger son Bobby has a store in Georgetown. He sells like music videos, T-shirts, and things like that. He's been there about 20 years. And our oldest, Ellen, works for the Department of Transportation. Has a very good job and likes it, and lives, as I say, near downtown Washington. Ellen, when she was younger, did a lot of traveling. She spent 14 months in Southeast Asia. She spent, I think, almost a year traveling on Europe and Israel. And when she came back, she worked for a tennis marketing firm. And they sent her to Paris in their Paris office for 14 months. And when she came back, they sort of dropped their tennis division and went into team sports and cut way back. And so her job was pretty much, it didn't exist anymore. And then she went to work for the Peace Corps headquarters for a couple of years. 7.5 years. And then after that, she went to work for the Department of Transportation, where she is now, and seemed to like what she's doing a lot. And we get together a lot, birthdays, anniversaries, and a lot of occasions. And we've tried to take a few trips with all 10 of the family. We went to Europe for our 50th wedding anniversary, and that really was great. And we were in Canada a few months ago, and we hope to take it more often, God willing.
Tell me about your grandchildren.
The grandchildren, they're nice, and we're close enough to them. We've done so much babysitting, schlepping, carpooling, etc., that we're really close with them. I can even say, hey, cut it out or whatever. I feel comfortable doing it. The oldest one just left for college. He was 18. There is kind of a difference in ages because, she's like into so many other things. The 9.5-year-old and the one who's going to be 12 are first cousins. In a sense, they're both raised as only siblings because there's such a big difference. They are inseparable. They are together constantly. Anytime they're not doing anything, they are together. They can spend days and days. My one son and daughter took the 2 of them to New York. They were together for 5 days. I don't know, they laugh, they play. I don't know what the heck they do, but they really get along well. I'm very fortunate, I guess everyone thinks this about their kids, but we really have wonderful children. I'm really proud of them. They're good citizens, they're good people, they're kind, they're generous, they're not snooty, they're friendly, they're just really good people. I'm really, really proud of them, and they're nice people, they're polite people. I know this sounds terrible to say, but we have nice children, and I'm happy, and they have wonderful children. They've done a good job. I think our boys are real devoted husbands. We get compliments from their wives all the time, and from their in-laws all the time, so that's even better. So that's about with our children. I just wanted to talk about the females a little bit in our family. Our daughter Ellen is the oldest, and she's a wonderful girl. She never married. She had opportunity. She's, I say so myself, a beautiful girl, and she's just been a wonderful daughter. I have been very fortunate. My kids were boys were smart. They both have fabulous wives. They're fabulous mothers. They couldn't be more devoted to their families, to their children, to their husbands. I mean, they're wonderful to Bud and to me. They really picked good, not wood. They both have wonderful marriages. I mean, the wives just couldn't be more devoted. I couldn't say more nicer things about them. And so naturally, we're thrilled about that. And they always make us feel welcome in our homes. They have us over a lot. And so we really feel blessed.
When we went to Washington, I went in the appliance business, and we had stores in and around the Washington area. And I think we had 7 stores, and then in 1974, we sold those stores to a Baltimore appliance dealer. And in 1973, we had opened a catalog business, catalog showroom. And we ran those and opened, we had 5 stores in and around the Washington area, 3 in Virginia, 2 in Maryland. And in 1983, I sold my half interest in that business to my partner. And I no longer was involved in any business. I think from then on, I was sort of spent the most time helping my son. My older son, Jimmy, had several small businesses. He started out with a newsstand, and would open up like carryouts, and he had several, and he did very well selling those, getting him started selling them. And a lot of them I helped him get started, helped him get occupancy permits and things like that. And he ultimately ended up owning a very large delicatessen in Lincoln, or in Washington. It was very well known, written up a lot in Washingtonian magazine, and he ran that for 7 years and sold it last year, and no longer has to have a business that's open 7 days a week and 8 to 10 every day. And now he has mostly his catering business downtown, and that closes at 4 o'clock, and he has no weekends. That works out pretty well. And I think as far as we like to do a lot of traveling, and I think we've been to a lot of places. My wife has been to more, certainly, than I have. Been to Europe probably 10, 12 times.
10, 12 times now, at least 30 or something.
30, okay, more. And we've been to India once. She's been there twice. And then we were in Australia once. And then you were in Burma.
I've been a lot of places, but doesn't like it's what I call, quote, exotic travel, because, it does take 14 hours, like, say, from California just to get there. I mean, the whole travel experience might be 20, 25 hours. But I have a woman friend, a very close friend, whose husband doesn't like what I call, again, exotic travel either. So I've taken a lot of trips, but we've been all over. She and I have been to India twice, once with them without our husbands. We've been to Burma, Cambodia, Vietnam. I've been to Egypt twice. That's just without Bud. I've been to Russia 3 times. Bud came once. But we have been to Europe dozens and dozens of times now. I feel really lucky. The reason we've been there so much is when Bud was in the appliance business, he used to win a lot of trips. They had these incentive trips, and so they were sort of free trips. And he used to win quite a few, and we went often, and we loved it so much. And then, when I said
our partner didn't like to travel, so
yeah,
it worked
so
out
we got all the trips came our way, right? The other thing is that after our children were a little bit older and in school all day, I went to work. I taught school for 5 years, and then I worked for the government for almost to the day, 25 years. I worked for VISTA, for the Peace Corps, and for the Corporation for National Service. All the agencies, all involved volunteers. For a long time, I was in charge of applications for people applying for VISTA in the Peace Corps. I was head of applicant evaluation. That was it. We had, maybe 60, 70,000 applications a year come through our office. And I had a staff of people, and they, read the applications, read the references, and then we had a rating system to see whether they made the program or not. I loved it. It was very interesting. It was a lot of fun. I met fascinating people that I'm still close with. But now I'm retired, Bud's retired. We still are big movie fans. We still go to the movies a lot. I'm still friendly. When I was at the Peace Corps, I was one of the older people, because most of the people who worked there were returned volunteers, people in their 20s. So now that we're in our 70s, these people are now like in maybe their late 40s. But we still see them often. We have them over for dinner a lot. We go to their house for dinner. We have tons of friends in Washington, and we go out, they come over. I don't know, just between the kids, the grandkids, and our friends, it just seems like we're busy all the time.
In closing, I'd like to tell my children and grandchildren that I love them very much.
And in closing, I just want to say to our children, it's start with age Ellen, Julie, Jimmy, Jennifer, Bobby, the 3 grandchildren, how proud I am of all of you, how much I love you all, how happy I am we're all in the same city. And one of these days, I hope you'll look at this when I'm gone, and I just want you to know I've had a wonderful life. You've helped to make it so wonderful for both Daddy and for me and for Grandpa and for me. I mean, you've given us so much pleasure, and we thank you so much for that, and thank you. We love you.